Obligations, particularly alternative and facultative obligations. If you are new to my channel, please go to the playlist. Andun yung mga videos concerning general provisions, nature and effect of obligations, as well as the kinds of obligations. This is already our part 4. So what is an alternative obligation? Para mas lalong maintindihan, example muna tayo. So here is our example. Joshua, he borrowed money from Julia and the amount is 50,000 pesos. It was agreed that Joshua could comply with his obligation by giving Julia an iPhone 11 Pro or by giving Julia the amount of 50,000 pesos or by painting the house of Julia. So ano ang napansin nyo? Here in alternative obligations, there are several objects or prestations. In our example, there are 3 prestations involved. And that is a prestation to give. That is to give Julia an iPhone 11 Pro. And there is another prestation that is a prestation to give again. And that is to give Julia the amount of 50,000 pesos. And a prestation to do, and that is to paint the house of Julia. So pag kayo ay tinanong what is an alternative obligation, just state there that it is an obligation which comprehends several objects or prestations which are due, but the payment or performance of one of them would be sufficient. How about a facultative obligation? Example muna tayo. I will give Alden my iPhone 12, but I may give my MacBook Air as a substitute. Ano ang napansin nyo? In facultative obligation, there is only one object or prestation. Kung kanina dun sa alternative, there are several objects or prestations. Here in facultative, there is only one object or prestation. So pag kayo ay tinanong what is a facultative obligation, your answer is it is an obligation which has only one object or prestation, but the obligor may deliver or render another one in substitution. Para mas lalo nyong ma-recall itong facultative obligation, please take note of F1, yung sa formula racing. Ano ba yung F1? F is for your facultative and 1 is for your one object or one prestation. So this is your facultative obligation. So if you will be asked, just like what happened in 1988 bar exams, define alternative and facultative obligations, then you know already how to answer them. Let's differentiate now alternative from facultative obligation. We start with the number of prestations. Sinabi na natin to, in alternative obligations, there are several objects or prestations that are due, but compliance with one is sufficient. Basis is Article 1199. A person who is alternatively bound by different prestations shall completely perform one of them. In facultative obligations, again, that is your F1, only one prestation is due, but si debtor is allowed to substitute another. Basis is Article 1206. Ano ang sinasabi ni Article 1206? When only one prestation has been agreed upon, but the obligor may render another in substitution, then the obligation is called facultative. Another difference is the right of choice. So, sino ang may right of choice sa alternative obligation? Answer, the right of choice belongs to the debtor, but it may be given to the creditor or third person. Basis, that is your Article 1200. Malinaw yan. The right of choice belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. How about in your facultative obligation? Meron din bang right of choice? Technically, you cannot say it as a right of choice because again, that is F1. In facultative obligation, there is only one prestation or there is only one object. So, wala ka talagang choice. But since you are allowed to make a substitute, the proper term pag facultative obligation is substitute. So, the right to make the substitution is given only to the debtor. Another difference is the effect of loss through fortuitous event. So in facultative obligation, if there is a loss of the thing due, then what happens? it will extinguish the obligation. Bakit? Because again, it is an F1. F1, there is only one object or one prestation. At pag yun ay nawala, and the reason for that is fortuitous event, then the result is it will extinguish the obligation. Going back to our example, if yung iPhone 12 is nawala and the reason is fortuitous event, then the obligation is extinguished. Can you say this also in alternative obligation? Answer, no. Bakit? Sa alternative obligation, the rule is dapat lahat mawala. So if there is a loss of only one or more of the alternatives but not all, and the reason is a fortuitous event, still it will not extinguish the obligation. So yung example natin kanina, pag ang iPhone 11 Pro or the MacBook Air is nawala, the obligation is still not extinguished because Joshua can still paint the house of Julia. So this is the difference of alternative and facultative obligation if there is a loss through fortuitous event. But I have to warn you though that in alternative obligations, it is subject to certain rules, and the rules are going to be discussed in the next slide. So here are the rules in alternative obligation if there is a loss or impossibility. Take note ha, pag pinag-uusapan ang loss or impossibility, first thing you have to do is you ask who has the right of choice. Is it the debtor or the creditor? And also, you have to remember that the loss or impossibility must be due to a fortuitous event. So what are the rules? First is if there is if one of the things rather is lost or one of the prestations cannot be performed, what will happen? The debtor must still comply with his obligation by delivering or performing that which he shall choose from among the remainder. Basis is Article 1204. Going back to our example, since there are 3 prestations involved here, at kung hindi na maibibigay ni Joshua ang iPhone 11 Pro dahil nawala, and the reason for that is a fortuitous event, then he must still comply and he shall choose from among the remainder. How about if all of the things are lost except one, or all of the prestations are lost except one cannot be performed? In that case, what will happen? The debtor must still comply with his obligation by delivering or performing that which remains. Basis is Article 1202. Ano ang sinasabi dyan ng Article 1202? The debtor shall lose the right of choice when among the prestations whereby he is alternatively bound, only one is practicable. So kung nawala si iPhone 11 Pro at kung nawala si MacBook Air, then Joshua has no other choice except to paint the house of Julia. How about if all of the things are lost or all of the prestations cannot be performed? Then what will happen? Then that is the time that the debtor is released from the obligation. Basis is Article 1174. So take note ha, these are the rules if the right of choice belongs to the debtor. How about if the right of choice belongs to the creditor? Ano ang rules? Article 1205 has the answer. The rule is the same. Ano ang sinasabi ni Article 1205? When the choice has been expressly given to the creditor, if one of the things is lost through a fortuitous event, then he shall perform the obligation by delivering that which the creditor should choose from among the remainder, if that is one of the things is only lost or one of the prestations cannot be performed, or that which remains if only one subsists. So take note of this. Still in alternative obligation, and we are still talking about the loss or impossibility. Again, pag loss or impossibility, what do? You have to determine who has the right of choice. Is it the debtor or the creditor? And what is the reason of the loss or impossibility? We are finished with the fortuitous event. Ngayon, ang pag-uusapan na natin is the fault of the debtor. The loss or impossibility is due to the fault of the debtor. So, what are the rules? If one or more but not all of the things are lost, or one or some but not all of the prestations cannot be performed, and the reason is because of the fault of the debtor, the creditor cannot hold the debtor liable for damages. The creditor cannot hold the debtor liable for damages. Bakit? Siya na nga ang may kasalanan. Bakit hindi pa rin siya liable for damages? The reason for that is the obligation can still be performed. We are talking about alternative obligations, and in alternative obligations, there are several objects or prestations. At dahil hindi naman nawala lahat, then the debtor can still perform the obligation. How about if all of the things are lost, or all of the prestations cannot be performed due to the fault of the debtor? Then this is now the time that the creditor can demand damages. The creditor shall have a right to indemnity for damages, as what is stated in your Article 1204. Let's read Article 1204. The creditor shall have a right to indemnity for damages when through the fault of the debtor all the things which are alternatively the object of the obligation have been lost, or the compliance of the obligation has become impossible. How about if the right of choice belongs to the creditor? Parehas lang ba ang rules? Answer is may difference, merong pagkakaiba. Because if the right of choice belongs to the creditor, and one or some but not all of the things are lost, or one or some but not all of the prestations cannot be performed, then the creditor has two choices. First choice is the creditor may claim any of those subsisting without damages on the part of the debtor. Second choice is the creditor may claim the price or value of that which was lost through the fault of the debtor, but with damages. Now, this is very clear according to your Article 1205. But take note if all of the things are lost, or all of the prestations cannot be performed, what is now the remedy of the creditor? The creditor can claim the price or value of any one of them with damages. So that is your Article 1205, number 2 and number 3. So these are the rules when it comes to the loss or impossibility due to the fault of the debtor. We'll go now to facultative obligation, and we will be talking about loss of the substitute. Again nasa facultative obligation tayo, and pag facultative obligation, ang pinag-uusapan is substitute. Because again, in facultative obligation, that is F1, there is only one prestation or one object which is due. And what will happen if that one object or one prestation that is due is lost or cannot be performed? Then the effect is it will extinguish the obligation. But since in facultative obligation that debtor is allowed to make a substitute, then what happens if there is a loss of the substitute? Yan ang pinag-uusapan natin dito. So ang reference point mo rito is, when did it happen? Did it happen before substitution or after substitution? Because if it happened before substitution, then there is no need for you to determine whether the debtor acted with fault or he did not act with fault. So, iisa ang rule, before substitution, if there is a loss of the thing intended as a substitute, the debtor is not liable. Reason, because that thing intended as a substitute is not due. So let's go back to our example. Our example is the MacBook Air is our substitute. So kung si MacBook Air ay nawala, at nawala siya before substitution, kahit may kasalanan ka or walang kasalanan ka, then you are not liable. Bakit? Because what is due is not the MacBook Air but the iPhone 12. How about after substitution? What is the effect? If the substitute is lost, the liability of the debtor depends whether or not the loss is due through his fault. So you now have to make a determination. Bakit ganyan ang rule? Because once the substitution is made, the obligation is converted into a simple obligation. And that simple obligation is to deliver or perform the substituted thing or prestation. This is very clear according to your Article 1206. So let's sum up what we have discussed. What is the effect of loss if there is a fault on the part of the debtor? In alternative obligation, again, what did we say? If there is a loss of one of the alternatives and it is through the fault of the debtor, still hindi pa rin liable si debtor. Bakit? Because again, the obligation can still be performed. The obligation can still be performed. How about in facultative obligation? If there is a loss of the thing due and that is through the fault of the debtor, then the debtor is liable. Bakit? Again, F1, there is only one obligation or prestation that is due at nawala pa yon at ang ikaw debtor ang may kasalanan, then you are liable. But take note, kung sinabi natin kanina, if there is a loss of one of the alternatives, and even if you are at fault debtor, still it will not make you liable. But if the right of choice belongs to the creditor, the loss of one alternative will give rise to liability. Bakit? Again, going back to our slide, if the right of choice belongs to the creditor has two options. And his option is, number one, he can claim any of those subsisting without damages on the part of the debtor, or the creditor may claim the price or value of that which through the fault of the debtor was lost or could not be performed with indemnity for damages. Malinaw yan under Article 1205. How about in facultative obligation? In facultative obligation, again, our reference point is before substitution and after substitution. If there is a loss of the substitute before substitution, kahit may kasalanan ka or wala kang kasalanan, still the debtor is not liable. Ano ulit ang sinabi natin? Before substitution, the loss of the thing intended as a substitute will not render the debtor liable. Reason, because that thing intended as a substitute is not due. Hindi yan ang iyong ibibigay. That is only a substitute. Another difference is the nullity of prestation. Actually, effect of nullity of prestation. So, pwede kasing mangyari that your prestation is unlawful or impossible, or it could not have been the object of the obligation. That is according to your Article 1200. And if that happens, you have no right to choose those prestations which are impossible, unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation. But what is its effect? The effect in alternative obligation is it will not invalidate the others. So going back to our example, if the iPhone 11 Pro is an unlawful prestation because baka produkto siya ng pagnanakaw, it will not invalidate if okay pa naman si MacBook Air and okay pa naman ang pagpipaint ng house on the part of Joshua. How about in facultative obligation? If the prestation agreed upon is null, then it will invalidate the obligation. Again, because F1. Dahil isa lang ang prestation, isa lang ang object which is involved or has been agreed upon, then if it is null, then the effect is it will invalidate the obligation. So going back to our example, if the iPhone 12 is a product of pagnanakaw, then it is an unlawful prestation, then the effect is it will invalidate the obligation. So kahit yung ibang prestations are impossible or unlawful or it could not have been the object of the obligation, the debtor or creditor shall still choose from among the remainder. Yan yung sinasabi ni Article 1204. But in facultative obligation, since there is only one object or one prestation, then you cannot choose. No more choice on your part. And the debtor also is not bound to choose the substitute. Let's end this video through this 1977 bar exam question, distinguish between alternative and facultative obligations. So this is the summary of what we have discussed. The source is De Leon. Thank you again for watching, for subscribing to my channel, and for telling me to your friends or relatives. Daghang salamat and have a good day.